Okay, and then, we really appreciate it. Oh, look how cute. I'm sorry. Look at it all
Okay. What did he get? Math? Is that a math scientist? It looks like it. Doctor? Doctor. That'll work. It's a wing. Oh, it's a wing.
That's a great word. You can't get used to it.
So, last year we covered a lot of really wonderful and important topics. Just to summarize all of last year, I'm going to give a pop quiz. What is the question? What is the question of the pop quiz?
What is God love? What is
You didn't raise your hand.
All right, the pop quiz question is, what's love got to do with it? And the answer is everything. So, because you guessed the question, Jimmy.
I was listening to you all this time.
What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So today we're going to start on Pilgrim's Progress. Steve has been very kind to. We took pictures in the book. This is a summary of the story. This is actually a real copy of the real book, and hopefully after we go through this, these 2 or 3 weeks, you'll want to go, if you don't already have a copy of this book, and read it, because the power of the story is in the details, and we can't cover everything, but you'll get the gist of it. Yes, Les?
Also, there's a free PDF.
Yes.
Online.
Right.
As well as audiobooks.
And also, I have one of the DVDs of the story. I'll loan to anybody if you want to borrow it for a week and bring it back next week. Huh? No, this is an old one. It's this one. You can kind of tell by the picture on the covers as to which version it is, but this is good.
Yeah, they did a version with it this summer, and they got an animated that was really good. It had some beautiful music in it by
Now, the actual name of the story, the name of the book, is The Pilgrim's Progress from This World to That Which Is to Come. So that gives you a little clue. Let me turn my volume down. Okay. So, Steve has the pictures that go along with the story. And it starts out where he's walking along and then he goes into a dream, and that's what that picture's out.
No, we don't move.
You all may want to come. Can you see? Can you see? Okay. John Clementi's going to read us this introduction.
And I looked up something. The first sentence has the word G-A-O-L, and that's, I guess, Old English for jail.
Yeah.
In the year 1676, a poor tinker named John Bunyan was imprisoned in Bedford jail. While he was there, he began to write one of the most famous books in the English language. Pictures came crowding through his mind, faster than he could put them into words. Quagmires and steep hills, sunny valleys and dark glens, a gloomy castle, its courtyard strewn with bones, a market town with all the bustle of a fair, and a narrow road from which one must not stray, running uphill and down dale to the dark river and the shining gate. Bunyan was 47 when he wrote The Pilgrim's Progress, and he drew on 2 main sources. First, his knowledge of the Bible. Secondly, his considerable knowledge of the world. Thus he had in mind the escape of Lot from Sodom, as he wrote the escape of Christian from the city of destruction. There were many pliables of his own congregation. Mr. Greatheart was a veteran of Cromwell's army. As to Vanity Fair, It was probably modeled on Stourbridge Fair near Cambridge, and the trial of faithful before Lord Hategood was based on Bunyan's own treatment at the hands of Justice Keeling. Bunyan tells his story as if it happened in a dream. He had no one to help him. He showed his work to no one till it was complete. Then many of his pious friends were shocked. It was, they said, an idle tale about giants and lions and goblins and warriors, sometimes fighting with monsters, and sometimes being lightly entertained by ladies in their palaces. To start with, it is true, the Pilgrim's Progress seems to have been published chiefly for the cottage and the servants' hall. The paper, the printing, and the engravings were all of the meanest description. But rapidly the fame of Bunyan grew, and his work has become recognized by millions of readers, not as an idle tale at all, but as a story with a hidden meaning, an allegory of that dangerous journey, which is in fact the journey of every man from this world to the next.
So how many of you all have read Pilgrim's Progress? How many of you are kind of familiar with the story? When they take surveys, most people don't even know about it. And that's because of our awful educational system nowadays since the 1900s. Oh, did I say that? The correct way to study is, okay. So this is, actually, I got this book in the Sagemont bookstore while I was, as Mark would say, lurking around looking for what I might use. And saw it, and I have actually had another book of my own, which came with a Pilgrim's Progress game that I bought. But I like this one much better and like the pictures better. Now here's the table of contents. Y'all can just look over those real quickly. I'm not going to read them. Okay. So here we go. I dreamed that I saw a man with his face turned away from his own house, a book in his hand, and a great burden on his back. I looked and saw him open the book and read therein, and as he read, he wept and trembled, and not being able to contain himself, he broke out with a lamentable cry, saying, "What shall I do to be saved?" For he lived in the city of destruction, which he learnt from his book was doomed to be burned with fire from heaven, in which fearful overthrow both himself and his wife and their 4 sons would miserably perish, unless some way of escape could be found. So Christian, for that was his name, went home to talk to his family, and they were greatly worried, not because they believed that what he said was true, but because they thought some kind of madness had got into the poor man. And as it was drawing towards night, they hoped that sleep might settle his brains. So with all haste they put him to bed. But the night was as troublesome to him as the day. Wherefore, instead of sleeping, he spent it in sighs and tears. So when morning was come, and they asked him how he was, he told them, "Worse, worse." He also started talking to them again, but they began to lose patience. Sometimes they would deride him. Sometimes they would chide him, and sometimes they would just quite neglect him. So Christian went by himself into the fields, still reading his book and carrying his burden, and greatly distressed in his mind. He looked this way and that way, as if he would run, yet he stood still, because he couldn't tell which way to go. Then in the distance, he saw a man approaching. His name was Evangelist, and he asked Christian, "What are you weeping for?" "Sir," he answered, "this book in my hand tells me to flee from the wrath to come. Also, I fear that this burden which is upon my back will sink me lower than the grave. Therefore, I need to get rid of it." "If this is so," said Evangelist, "then why are you standing still?" "Because I don't know where to go," he answered. Then Evangelist pointed with his finger over a wide field. "Do you see yonder wicket gate?" he asked. "No," said Christian. "Then do you see a shining light?" "I think I do," said Christian. Then said Evangelist, Keep that light in your eye and go in that direction. So shall you reach the gate. There, when you knock, it will be told you what to do. So I saw in my dream that the man began to run, but he hadn't run far before his wife and children saw him running. And he called after him to return. But the man put his fingers in his ears and ran on. He didn't look back, but ran toward the middle of the plain. The neighbors too came out to see him run, and as he ran, some mocked and others threatened. A couple of them were resolved to fetch him back by force. The name of one was Obstinate, and the name of the other was Pliable. Now by this time the man had gone a good distance from them. Nevertheless they pursued after him and overtook him. Neighbors, why have you come? Asked Christian. To persuade you to come back with us, they said. That can no means be, said Christian. You dwell in the city of destruction. Be content, good neighbors, to go along with me. What? Said Obstinate, and leave our friends and our comforts behind us? Yes, for I seek an endless kingdom which we may inhabit forever. Read of it, if you will, in my book. Tush, cried Obstinate. Away with your book. Will you go back with us or no? No, not I. Pliable so far had held his peace, but now he spoke. If what Christian says is true, I intend to go with this good man. Very well then, replied Obstinate. I will go back to my own place. I'll be no companion to such fantastical fellows. With that they parted. Obstinate went back, and Christian and Pliable went on over the plain, discoursing all the while. Tell me more, neighbor Christian, inquired Pliable, about the place to which we're going. Christian told him, there are crowns of gold to be given us, and garments shining like the sun. That's very pleasant, and what else? There shall be no more crying, said Christian, for the owner of the place will wipe all tears from our eyes. Well, my good companion, I'm glad to hear these things. Come on, let's hurry. I can't go any faster, answered Christian, with this burden on my back. Now I saw in a dream that as they were hurrying along and talking, they had drawn near to a quagmire in the middle of the plain, which was called the Slough of Despond. And before they knew what was happening, they had both fallen into the bog. It was a bog where many travelers before them had been drowned. Here therefore they wallowed, being grievously bedaubed with the dirt. And Christian, because of the burden on his back, began to sink, first knee-deep, then waist-deep, into the loathsome scum. Neighbor Christian, where are you now? Asked Pliable. Truly, I do not know, Christian replied. So Pliable began to be offended, and angrily said to his fellow, Is this the happiness you promised me? If we have such ill speed at our first setting out, what may we expect between this and our journey's end? With that, having no burden to contend with, Pliable scrambled out on that side of the slough which was nearest to his own house, and so he ran off home for a hot bath, leaving Christian to his fate. For his part, Christian was struggling to reach the side of the slough nearest to the wicket gate, which he eventually did, but couldn't clamber out by reason of the burden on his back. Then I beheld in my dream that a man came to him, whose name was Help, and asked him what he was doing here. Christian answered, Sir, I was bidden to go this way by a man called Evangelist. But did you not look for the stepping stones? Fear followed me so hard that I fell in, replied Christian. That is the snare and hazard of this place, he said Help. It so spews out its filth that at the changes of the weather, these steps are hardly seen. Here, give me your hand. So Christian gave him his hand and drew him out, set on firm ground again. And Christian continued on his way toward the wicket gate. Although he didn't know it, worse trouble lay in store. For a certain Mr. Worldly Wise Man was now seen crossing the field to meet him. He dwelt in the town of Carnal Policy, a very great town, hard by where Christian lived. This man then, having some inkling of him, for Christian's departure from the city of destruction was much noised abroad, began to question him. How now, good fellow, where are you going with that great burden? I'm going to yonder wicket gate. Have you a wife and children? Asked Mr. Worldly Wise Man. Why, yes, replied Christian, but I am so heavily weighed down I can't take pleasure in them any more. Who counseled you to start upon this dangerous journey? A man came to me. His name, I think, was Evangelist. I thought as much, said Worldly Wise Man. He is forever leading travelers astray. There's no more difficult road in the world than the one he's directed you to. I see by the dirt on you that you've already been in the slough of despond. But that slough is only the beginning of your troubles. In the way you're going, you are likely to encounter far worse things than this. Lions, dragons, darkness, and death. This has been so confirmed by many witnesses. So why would a man so carelessly risk his life by giving heed to a stranger? After pausing for breath, Mr. Worldly Wise Man proceeded as follows. Hear me, I am older than you, and I'll give you some advice. In yonder village there dwells a gentleman whose name is Legality, a very judicious man, a man of very good name. He has skill to help men off with their burdens. He has, to my knowledge, cured several who were going out of their wits because of them. His house is not a mile from this place, and if he's not at home himself, his son, who's called Civility, will help you. Moreover, if you wish, there are houses standing empty in the village at reasonable rates. The food is cheap and good, and you can send for your wife and family and all live happily together. Christian, we fear, was all too ready to listen to Mr. Worldly Wise Man and leave the straight path he was on. Sir, which is the way to this honest man's house? He inquired. Do you see yonder high hill? Asked Mr. Worldly Wise Man. Yes, very well. By that hill you must go, and the first house you come to is Mr. Legality's. Thus did Mr. Worldly Wise Man courteously direct poor Christian down the wrong road. For what he had failed to tell him was the hill ahead was a fearsome mountain. It seemed to overhang the road so much that Christian, looking up as the clouds scudded over it, was afraid that it would fall upon his head. Worse than that, there were flashes of fire coming out of it. And Christian, because of his burden, might easily have fallen, and thus early on in his journey have been burnt to death. Wherefore he did sweat and quake for fear.
I'm going to make sure everybody sees the magnitude. Christian's in the bottom right corner.
At that moment, who should appear but Evangelist? Every time I say Evangelist, Les, you get to go do-do-do. Coming to meet him with a severe and dreadful countenance, at the sight of which Christian began to blush with shame. Aren't you the man I found weeping outside the city of destruction? Questioned Evangelist. Yes, dear sir, I am the man. Did I not direct you to the little wicket gate? Yes, dear sir, replied Christian. How is it then that you so quickly turned aside? I met, you see, a gentleman, and he persuaded me that I might find in the village before me a man who could take off my burden. He said, moreover, he would show me a better way, not so attended with difficulties as the way, sir, that you set me in. Then said Evangelist, stand still a little. So he stood trembling. And Evangelist said, you have rejected the word of God for the advice of Mr. Worldly Wise Man. But Mr. Legality cannot free you of your burden. Mr. Legality is a cheat. As for his son Civility, notwithstanding his simpering looks, he cannot help you either. As he spoke, there was a great clap of thunder, and Christian called himself 1,000 fools for listening to Mr. Worldly Wise Man. I am sorry I have hearkened to this man's counsel, he said, turning back with haste. He spoke to no one on the way, nor if anybody asked him would he give them an answer. He went like one that was all the while treading on forbidden ground, and could no means think himself safe till he had regained the road he had abandoned. But would he ever reach it? He wasn't at all sure. For narrow is the gate, it says in his book, and few are those who find it. This is part 2, the interpreter's house. I saw then in my dream that ahead of Christian, on a grassy bank, lay 3 men fast asleep, with fetters on their heels. They were called Simple, Sloth, and Presumption, Christian knew that to sleep on this particular road was like sleeping in the rigging of a ship when a storm was brewing. "Wake up," he cried, "and I will help you off with your irons." But they only opened one eye at him and yawned. Simple said, "I see no danger." Sloth said, "I want to go on sleeping." Presumption said, "Every tub must stand on its own bottom." Then all three rolled over and went to sleep again. So Christian proceeded on his way, troubled to think that men in such danger should so little esteem his kindness in waking them. And we are now to learn how wise it was of Christian to warn them. For as he drew near to the narrow wicket gate, he saw that it was firmly closed. And even as he reached it, he felt the wind of an arrow swish past his ear and bury itself in the woodwork. Looking round in terror, he now saw on the opposite hill a strong castle with a host of dark, menacing figures on the battlements. Christian didn't dally. Over the gate was written, "Knock, and it shall be opened unto you." He knocked with all his might. A second arrow narrowly missed him. "Who's there?" asked a voice. "A poor burdened traveler. I come from the city of destruction, and I'm going to the celestial city." To his relief, the gate was quickly opened, and a hand pulled him in. Then Christian asked the guardian of the gate, whose name was Goodwill, "What mean these arrows?" To which he answered, "Yonder castle belongs to Beelzebub, the prince of the devils. Both he and his soldiers will shoot their darts at anyone who tries to enter here. They aim to kill you before you can reach safety. You are fortunate to be alive." "I tremble and rejoice," said Christian. "Why do you come alone?" asked Goodwill. "Because none of my neighbors and none whom I encountered on the road saw the danger." "Did none of them follow you?" "Pliable came with me a little way until we fell, both together, into the slough of despond," Christian answered. At that he was discouraged and would not adventure further. "Alas, poor man, is it not worth running a few risks when the heavenly city is your destination?" Goodwill asked. "But I'm not one to talk," replied Christian. "I also nearly turned aside, persuaded by the arguments of Mr. Worldly Wiseman. And I don't know what would have become of me had not Evangelist met me again when I was musing in the midst of my dumps. And truth to tell, I'm still much inconvenienced by this burden that is upon my back." Then I saw in my dream that Christian asked him if he could help him off with his burden. "However I try," said Christian, "I don't seem able to move it." Goodwill said, "No man can get it off you, but keep to the straight and narrow path, and it will lead you to the place of deliverance." So Christian began to gird his loins and to address himself to his journey. How far will it be, he asked himself as he plodded on his way. His next stop was the house of the interpreter, who, Goodwill had told him, would give him useful lessons for his journey. It was a large and mysterious house, such as one visits in dreams. His master, in answer to his knock, asked him what he wanted. "Sir," said Christian, "I'm a man that's going to Mount Zion, and I was told that if I called here, you would show me excellent things which would help me." "Come in," said the interpreter. First he led him into a parlor which was full of dust because it was never swept. So the interpreter called for a serving maid to sweep it. But the dust began to fly, and Christian began to choke. Never had there been such dust. He groped around blithely. Then he heard the interpreter tell the maid, "Bring hither water and sprinkle the room." All at once the dust had cleared, and the maid was sweeping it up with pleasure. "This parlor," said the interpreter, "is the soul of man clogged with the dust of sin. But see how easily, by God's grace, it can be cleansed." Yay! I saw in my dream that the interpreter took Christian by the hand again and led him into a very dark room where there sat a man in an iron cage. Now the man seemed very sad. He sat with his eyes looking down to the ground and his hands folded together, and he sighed as if his heart would break. Then said Christian, "Who is this?" The interpreter said, "Talk with him and see." So Christian said, "What used you to be?" The man said, "I was once a flourishing professor, both in my own eyes and also in the eyes of others. I was on my way, as I thought, to the celestial city, and I was confident that I would get there." "But what did you do to bring yourself to this condition?" Christian asked. I failed to keep watch, the man replied. I followed the pleasures of this world, which promised me all manner of delights. But they proved to be an empty bubble, and now I am shut up in this iron cage, a man of despair who can't get out. No further explanations were given. No one said who put him there, but the interpreter whispered to Christian, bear in mind, bear well what you have seen. Finally, Christian was led to a gateway like the one which he had lately entered. Beside it sat a man at a table with a book and inkhorn before him to take the name of anyone who wished to pass through. But the gate was guarded by fierce men in armor, ready to do what hurt and mischief they could to any traveler. And though there stood a great company of people desirous of going in, they didn't dare. Then, as if it were a scene upon the stage, Christian saw a valiant man approaching. Set down my name, sir, he said. That done, he drew his sword and rushed upon the armed men, who laid upon him with deadly force. But the man, not at all discouraged, fell to cutting and hacking most resolutely. So after he had received and given many wounds, he cut his way to safety. So Christian said, I think I know the lesson of this. My safety will depend, it seems, not on cleverness, but on simple courage. And he resumed his journey. How his burden had got on his back in the first place, and why nobody else had burdens, as happens in a dream, we are not told. But never had he been so eager as he was now to be rid of it. And that, did he but know it, was only half the battle. Now I saw in my dream that the road from then on was fenced on either side with a wall. The wall was named Salvation. Along this road did burdened Christian run. Or we should say he did his best to run as far as he could with that load upon his back. At the foot of a hill he passed an empty tomb. Then up again. Upon a little knoll he found himself beneath a wayside cross, and as its shadow fell across him, so suddenly the burden slipping from his shoulders fell from off his back. It tumbled down the hill. It tumbled into the mouth of the tomb. It was never seen again. Christian kept feeling behind his back. He couldn't believe it, for it was very surprising to him that the simple act of gazing at the cross had set him free, and his burden of guilt was gone. As he stood there in amazement, behold, 3 shining ones appeared. Listen. The first one said, your soul is now swept clean of sin. The second stripped him of his mud-stained rags and gave him bright new clothes. The third one handed him a parchment. Guard it carefully, he said, and surrender it only when you have reached the gate of the celestial city. Great dangers lay ahead of him, but for the moment he was as light as air. So Christian gave 3 leaps of joy and went on singing. This is the third part, the hill difficulty. As Christian now set off again, free of his burden and light of foot, suddenly, to the left of him, 2 strangers jumped over the wall and came at him apace. The name of the one was Formalist, and the name of the other Hypocrisy. Gentlemen, asked Christian, where have you come from and where are you going? We were born in the land of vainglory, and we are on our way to the heavenly city, they replied. Then why did you jump over the wall instead of coming through the narrow wicket gate? Did you not know that he who climbs in by some other way is a thief and a robber? It's a long way around to the wicket gate, said Formalist and Hypocrisy. Our countrymen always take this shortcut. They've been doing it for hundreds of years, so it can't be wrong. Christian said, but it's breaking the rules of the journey. The 2 men said, what's the matter how we did it? If we're in, we're in. Christian said, I walk by the rule of my master. You follow your own fancies. To this they gave him no answer. Only they looked upon each other and laughed. So they continued on their way, the 3 of them together. I beheld them that they reached a crossroads. One broad road turned to the left. The other broad road turned to the right. While the narrow road went straight up the great black back of the hill called Difficulty. Which one would they choose? Formalist chose to go the left, which led him into a dark wood. Did he but know it, the road was called Danger, and he lost his way forever. Hypocrisy chose to go to the right, which led him into rough ground full of holes and hummocks. Did he but know it, the road was called destruction. Here he stumbled and fell, and rose no more. As for Christian, he paused and drank at a spring to refresh himself. Then, after looking both ways, to the left and the right, he started briskly, straight on up the hill. But soon he was wondering, had he chosen wisely? For he went from running to walking, from walking to clambering, and now he was on his hands and knees because of the steepness of the place. Then, just as he was about to give up, midway to the top of the hill, he espied a pleasant arbor made by the Lord of the hill for the refreshing of weary travelers. And that's down here to the right. Here Christian gratefully sat down to rest, and pulling out the parchment which the shining ones had given him, so Christian read the parchment to his comfort. He also looked with admiration at the embroidered coat, which had been given him as he stood by the cross. Thus pleasing himself a while in the drowsy warmth of the afternoon sun, he first fell into a slumber and then fast asleep. When he awoke, it was late evening, so he quickly rose up and hastened on his way. Then coming towards him, he heard the sound of running feet, and out of the twilight 2 men appeared. The name of the first one was Timorous, and the other Mistrust. Christian asked them, "Sirs, what's the matter? You run the wrong way." "It's true, we were going to the heavenly city and had climbed the hill Difficulty," said Timorous, "but the further we went, the more danger we met. Therefore we turned and are going back. Therefore, there were these 2 lions in the way," added Mistrust. "Whether asleep or awake, we knew not, but we agreed that if we came within reach, they would tear us to pieces." So saying, Timorous and Mistrust ran on down the hill, leaving Christian much perplexed, for now he said to himself, "If I go forward, I shall perish. Likewise, if I go back to my own country, I shall perish. What am I to do?" Then he remembered his parchment and felt for it under his coat. It had always been a help and comfort to him. But though he felt for it everywhere, he couldn't find it. He must have dropped it, and it would have been his passport, without which he couldn't enter the celestial city. As so often happens in dreams, that which he dreaded most had come to pass. He had no choice. He must go back. So sighing deeply and chiding himself for being such a fool, he retraced his steps, looking on this side and that. It was growing darker all the time, and the night was full of whispers and unearthly sounds. Dark though it was when he reached the arbor, God directed his eye to the place where the parchment lay. It must have slipped from him while he was asleep. With great joy he picked it up, but then he cried, "Oh dear, I have trod the same road 3 times, which I should have trod but once. How far might I have been now if I had kept going?" He truly feared that he would be benighted. "Oh, thou sinful sleep," he cried, "for thy sake I must walk without the sun." He also remembered how Mistrust and Timorous had been frightened by the lions. "These beasts," he said to himself, "seek their prey by night, and if they should meet me in the dark, how should I escape them?" And again he asked himself, "What shall I do?" There was still light enough to read his parchment, and this is what he read. "Desire now a better country, that is, the heavenly one." And with these words to strengthen him, Christian resumed his climb. Lifting up his eyes, he saw against the sky the towers of a stately palace, the palace beautiful. "Here, perhaps," he thought, "they'll give me lodgings for the night." So I saw in my dream that he made greater haste, but as he drew nearer, he could hear in the darkness the roaring of the lions. The only way forward was along a narrow passage which was about a furlong from the porter's lodge. This, he knew, was the place from which Mistrust and Timorous had fled, and Christian was never so near to running back after them. But the porter at the lodge, whose name was Watchful, perceiving now that Christian made a halt, cried out, "Is your strength so small? Fear not the lions. They are on long chains. If you keep strictly to the beam of light in the center of the path, they cannot reach you." So Christian moved on. He took good heed to the directions of the porter. At the same time, he trembled for fear of the lions, for now they were on either side of him, straining at their chains. And how they roared and snapped at him, and how they tried to catch him by the foot. But Christian soldiered on boldly, and in another minute he was through and had reached the gate unharmed. Then, somewhat breathlessly, he asked the porter, "Sir, may I lodge here for the night?" "That depends," he said, looking at him suspiciously. "What's your name, and what's your business?" "My name is Christian. I'm come from the city of destruction, and I'm going to the heavenly city." "But how does it happen that you come so late?" asked the porter. "The sun has set." "I had been here sooner, but wretched man that I am, I slept in the arbor that stands on the hillside, and there I dropped my parchment and came without it to the brow of the hill. Then feeling for it and finding it not, I was forced to go back for it." "Well, that's a sorry tale to be sure," said the porter, "but I will summon one of the young ladies that live here. If she likes your talk, she may bring you in to the rest of the family, or contrariwise she may not." So watchful, the porter rang the bell, and there appeared at the sound of it a grave and beautiful damsel called Discretion. She questioned him closely, asking him what he had seen and met on the way, and he told her. So she smiled, but the tears stood in her eyes. And after a little pause, she said to his relief, "We have to be careful whom we admit here, but this house was built by the Lord of the hill for the benefit of pilgrims. So with the Lord's blessing, come in." Then he bowed his head and followed her into the house. And when she and her sisters had made ready, they sat down to meat. After supper, they committed themselves to their Lord for protection, and then betook themselves to rest. Christian they laid in a large upper chamber, whose windows opened upon the sun rising, and the name of the chamber was Peace. So for a little while Christian was safe, and much he needed to renew his strength, for on the morrow, though he knew it, he had to fight the foul fiend Apollyon. Okay, we're going to stop right there. So, the first question, oh, we have questions.
Yeah, we do.
We're going to skip over some things. So the first question is, what is this story all about? Okay, Les, you can go, da-da-da. Okay, thank
Do you
you.
have an answer, or?
Well, I mean, just,
I can,
Progress through diverse, through problems and coping with problems.
yes, for sure.
and we can see that many of the characters are like ourselves, just what we kind of go through, Christian life, as you will, and kind of go along, the journey, all the doubts and fears and, all that.
Yeah, sure. So, when Bunyan wrote this, he was in prison. He started writing it when he was in prison, and he finished it, I think, 10 years later. And so, part of his foundation for the whole story was that we're actually in a prison of the world, but that there's a spiritual world in which we are free. And all through the story, Christian has to learn this. So that's his great challenge, is to understand how to recognize that. And so, what would you say that the major themes are? We've actually already mentioned some of them, but actually, I'll go on to the next question because it's the same thing. How does this story apply to you in your life? Because that's what the book is all about. It's about our journey.
Victor?
I was going to say, kind of, I see a little bit of some of the characters in myself. I mean,
Well, yeah, we all do.
So, yeah, I mean, that kind of, I don't like to admit it, I guess. But
Well,
yeah.
Right. And so, the whole issue of temptation is just all through this, he's walking along and here comes a temptation, but he doesn't recognize it. He thinks he can find an easier way, right? A faster way, something that won't be so hard. And every time one of these tempters come along, it's always that, and that's us too. It's like, do I really have to go through that? I think I can figure this out better. There's three. There are three basic scriptural scenarios that are kind of typical of temptation. Are we there?
You're there.
I can't see. All right. We are going to read 1 John 2:15. Would somebody read that for me? Anybody?
It's right there.
It's on the screen. That John 2:15.
It's a pretty picture. Pretty picture.
Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, and the lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life, is not from the Father, but from the world.
Okay. One of my favorite proverbs in the Living Bible says, don't even put your foot on the path that leads to temptation. And for some reason that really has been a powerful guiding light. It's easier to stop something before it even starts, in other words, and I found that that's true. Why is it important for us to be aware of the temptations that come to us?
Well, they're all distracting.
Yeah.
Yeah, the distracting takes away from what the real purpose of our walk is supposed to be.
Yeah. And also, yes, and also you'll think every sin is preceded by a temptation. And that makes the whole issue of temptation much, much more important for us to be aware of. And most of you don't know it, but I actually made a game. It's a board game called Temptation, and it's got all these different areas, ways that we can be tempted, and what the scriptural, what God's way is for us to deal with the temptation instead of our own natural way.
George, you have something to say?
Another interesting one about the companions that they had there, as there was some alternative way which might be easier. It said how that individual that took that way led to doom.
Yeah. Okay. Next.
I was going to say that it's a journey, right, for the Christian, that contrary to some that advocate that, it'll be wonderful and easy. That's not so. It is a difficult path, and at every stage of difficulty, there pops up some options which seem attractive or seem to alleviate that difficulty, but they're very short-sighted, very short-term, and eventually they don't lead to anything better. That is the ultimate goal, of course, is to stay on the.
So next week, we're fixing to go back into the last section of the story, but next week we're going to talk about the temptations of Adam and Eve in the garden, temptations of Jesus before he started his ministry, and then this 1 John 2:15, which is us. And we're going to talk about what do all those have in common, because actually it's this the temptation of our eyes and the flesh and the pride of life. And actually, we could even start with Satan's temptation. How was it that, if we wanted to get into a bag of worms, how was it that Satan came to rebel against God? And we can think about, were they these three same temptations? But we'll talk about that next week. Okay, next is section 4,
We're going back.
The fight with Apollyon. Then I saw in my dream that on the morrow Christian desired to go forward on his journey. But the ladies of the house, whose names were Charity, Piety, Prudence, and Discretion, told him that he should not depart thence, till they had shown him the rarities of the place. For the day be clear, they said, we will show you the delectable mountains. So he consented and stayed. And when morning was up, they took him to the roof of the palace. Look to the south, they said. So he did, and behold, the mountains in the sunlight were indeed delectable and beautified with woods. From the top of these mountains, they told him, you may see the gate of the celestial city. This greatly encouraged him, yet in truth the city was still a long way off, and the journey, as we know, had to all be done on foot. So once again, Christian desired to be going, but once again they detained him. Now it was the turn of Charity to question him. Have you a family? Asked Charity. Are you a married man? I have a wife and 4 small children, Christian replied. Then why didn't you bring them along with you to share in your felicity? She questioned. At this our traveler began to weep. Oh, how willingly I would have done so, but they were all of them averse to going on pilgrimage. My wife was afraid of losing the comforts of this world, and my children were given to the foolish delights of youth. So what with one thing and another, to my great grief, they would not come. From all that had befallen him so far, you may think he did prudently to make the journey first alone. The other damsels said as much. But still they would not let him go till they had led him to the armory, which they showed him some of the objects with which the servants of the Lord had done wonderful things. They showed him Moses' rod, the hammer and nail with which Jael slew Sisera, the pitchers, trumpets, and lamps too, with which Gideon put to flight the armies of Midian. They showed him also the jawbone of the ass with which Samson did such mighty deeds, and they showed him the sling and the stone with which David slew Goliath. Then they fitted Christian out with the armor, which their Lord provided for the use of travelers, that they should be ready for any assaults along the way, and that they should stand their ground when things were at their worst, and having done all, to stand. First the helmet and breastplate that could save his life. This is James' territory here. Then the faithful shield to fend off the fiery darts of the wicked. Then the trusty sword that could cut through anything. Finally his feet were shod with shoes that would never wear out, for he was setting out, they said, not against human foes, but against the wiles of the devil. Thus, fully armed, did Christian hurry to the gate, and there he asked the porter, Have you seen any other pilgrims pass this way? The porter answered, Yes. Pray, did you know him? Asked Christian. I asked about his name, and he told me it was Faithful. He is my townsman, my near neighbor, Christian exclaimed. He comes from the place where I was born. How far do you think he is ahead of me? By this time he will be below the hill, answered the porter. Well, good porter, the Lord be with you. If I hasten, I may catch him up. He was not to overtake his friend that day. Instead, he found himself in a solitary valley, called the Valley of Humiliation. Here, after he had stopped to partake of the bread and wine and raisins which the damsels had given him, he was feeling well content. Perhaps, he said to himself, the worst is over. All of a sudden a darkness fell across the sun. What could it be? He roused himself, and there he saw, stalking toward him, the towering shape of a foul fiend. He was at least 9 feet high, and the nearer he came, the more hideous he grew. He had scales like a fish, and they are his pride. He had wings like a dragon and feet like a bear, and out of his belly came fire and smoke. As happens in a dream, Christian recognized the fiend at once and knew his name. It was Apollyon. Terrified, he cast in his mind whether to go back or stay firm. Then, considering that he had no armor on his back and to turn his back to the monster would give him the advantage, he resolved to stay firm. The fiend had now drawn very close. He looked upon Christian with a disdainful countenance and thus began to question him. Where have you come from? I've come from the city of destruction, which is the place of all evil. Oh, by this I perceive that you are one of my subjects, said Apollyon, for I am the prince of that city, and all that country is mine. Why then are you running away from your prince? I was indeed born in your dominions, admitted Christian, but I have given my allegiance to another, who is the king of princes. How can I now with fairness go back on this? You did the same to me, and yet I'm willing to pass it over, replied Apollyon. What I promised you it was in my infancy, said Christian. Besides, to tell you the truth, I like his service better than yours. You have already been unfaithful to him, exclaimed Apollyon. You fell in the slough of despond. You slept and left your parchment, and in all you say and do, you are endlessly desirous of vainglory. Too well I know it, yet the king whom I serve is merciful and ready to forgive. I am the enemy of this king, said Apollyon. I hate his person, his laws, and his people. Moreover, there is no prince who will lightly lose his subjects. Neither will I lose you. Give him the slip and work for me, and your wages shall be doubled. I know your wages, you are destroying Apollyon. They are not such as a man can live on. They are wages of death. Then Apollyon broke into a grievous rage. What you say is true, therefore prepare yourself to die. Apollyon, beware of what you're doing, cried Christian, for I am on the king's highway, the way of holiness. Therefore take heed to yourself. But Apollyon straddled over the whole breadth of the way and barred his path. I am void of fear in this matter. I swear by infernal din that you shall go no further. Here I will spill your soul. So without more ado, the fiend threw a flaming dart at Christian's breast. But Christian had his shield in his hand, and so prevented him. Then Christian drew his sword, for he saw it was time to bestir himself, and the fiend made fast at him, and threw his darts as thick as hail. And though he did all he could to avoid them, and in spite of the new armor that he wore, Christian was wounded in the head, the hand, the foot, and forced to yield ground. But he still resisted as manfully as he could, hoping perhaps some other traveler would hear the clash of arms and come to his assistance. But any within earshot were too cowardly to fight. They made a wide detour rather than encounter such a fiend. The combat now had lasted half the day. You couldn't imagine, if you had not been there, what yelling and roaring Apollyon made, and what sighs and groans burst from the pilgrim's heart. For you must know that by reason of his wounds, Christian was growing weaker by the hour. Then Apollyon saw his chance, and came in close, and wrestling with Christian gave him such a dreadful fall that his sword flew from his hand. Now I am sure of you, the fiend cried, and kneeling on him as he lay helpless upon his back, he pressed him near to death. But as God would have it, while Apollyon was preparing his final blow, thereby to make an end of this good man, Christian nimbly stretched out his hand for his sword and caught it, saying, Rejoice not against me, O mine enemy. When I fall, I shall arise. With that, he ran Apollyon through, and with a terrible roar, as one that had received a mortal wound, the fiend drew back. Then for the first time Christian smiled, for looking up, he saw Apollyon spread his dragon's wings and fly away, dripping blood over the fields as he went. So the battle was over, and Christian offered thanks for his deliverance. But he too was bleeding copiously, as if he was to bleed to death his victory, and if he was to bleed to death, his victory would have been in vain. Then in his mercy, God directed him toward a certain tree, the tree of life, the leaves of which he now applied to all his wounds. They staunched the flow of blood, and he was healed immediately. He also sat down in that place to eat and drink, and so refreshed, Christian went forward to the valley's end. He left his heavy armor there, but left his sword still drawn in his hand. For all I know, he said, some other enemy lies even now in wait for me. Indeed, far worse things lay ahead, worse even than his combat with the fiend. Okay, we're stopping now. However, next week we pick up with the valley of the shadow of death he has to go through. So,
Thank you.
So, I know that when I started studying the subject of temptation, I was amazed at how much of my life what's happening to me. I just hadn't recognized them before. And there's a little saying, you can let little birds fly overhead, but you don't have to let them nest in your hair. And we have thoughts that come and go, and everything isn't a temptation until we let it get to the point where it becomes a problem, So as we read the Word and understand more and more about God's ways and God's plan, we just become more sensitive when something has happened, like to poor old Christian, like here's the path, and we're like, stay on the path, Christian, stay on the path. And he's like, oh no, this will be easier. Oh no, this will be faster. So I think our lives are like that a lot. I know mine has been and sometimes we think, okay, we deal with something that's been a temptation. The Bible talks about a besetting sin. Something that almost everybody has something that, like Paul, right? He prayed that God would take away the thorn in his flesh. We don't really know what that was, but it was something that he prayed that God would take away. But most of us can identify something that's a continuing problem for us. And we can think we've dealt with it, right? Put it under the blood, etc., whatever. And I know I had a besetting sin earlier in my life, and I thought I had totally taken care of that, right? That was never again going to be a problem for me. And I was just sure of that. Well, all of a sudden, like about 2 years ago, all of a sudden I realized that thing was staring me straight in the face, and I just couldn't believe it. I thought, what? It took me a while to get it, I was being tempted with this thing that I thought I was done with. So it's like we must ever be vigilant that Satan is always, he's subtle and uses different ways to get to us. So, but if we know that that's real, that puts us on our guard. So anyway, Christian still he's got some armor, right? He finally fought off Apollyon, and now he thinks, okay, this is probably, I'm past the worst of it now, but however, he's fixing to go into the valley of the shadow of death, right? So.
Any questions, comments?
Who's the author of this book that you have?
John Bunyan.
But I mean,
No.
no.
Oh, the book, your book, Mom,
Children's
the children's version.
Okay, it's called Dangerous Journey.
Yeah, this is a children's version.
Is the church have copies?
I got this from the bookstore, but this was their own. I went in there and I asked her, what's her name, the manager, Kathy or Becky? I said, do you have a copy of Pilgrim's Progress? This was a month ago. And she said, no, but we have a children's version. I said, show it to me.
She can order stuff. Well, I was wondering, since we're doing it in a class, they sometimes give a 25% off.
They do. They give a 20% discount.
Oh, 20%.
Yeah, and if anybody would like to borrow my Pilgrim's Progress DVD for a week, and then this is my copy, but there are a lot of different versions, and there's a modern translation, but I read kind of the more regular one, and I loved it. And of course, some people don't want to read all the archaic language, but I got a lot out of this. Anyway, thank you all.
I am curious, what do you all see as the commonality between the three different, we never answered this question. What's the commonality between the three temptations that are up there on the screen? Adam and Eve, Christ, us. What's the commonality?
Each one of them, the individual is given something with sugar-coated item. Do this and you will enjoy it, but it's not, you need to look beyond it. And sometimes it's a tough choice, but look past it.
Very astute. James?
The thing I see is Satan have a three-pronged attack. Lust of the eye, lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. And he is not deviating from that from the beginning up until now. It's very effective for him to use that. He might change it, disguise it, but underneath that is what you're going to be dealing with. And, and one of the other things, talking about one of the things with, Christian, you know, we all want to be comfortable and we have to be careful of focusing too much on being comfortable because that's where the three things that come in, you know, you can be comfortable if you do this, you can be comfortable if that happened or whatever. But, it's Satan's way of, getting us to deviate from keeping our focus on the celestial city.
Yeah, and you know, even with Eve in the garden, you know, we think, you know, here they were living in paradise. Why in the world would they disobey God? You know, when he had given them this perfect world to live in. But you know, when Satan was talking to Eve, and you know, he said, "Oh, look at this tree. It's good to eat, and it makes you wise." You know, so she thought, we can tell when you read the text, she thought she was doing something good. She knew she was disobeying God, but she thought, well, it's okay because this is a good thing to do. And that's a deception it's so sneaky, it's hard to wrap your hands around it, you know, to think you're doing good. But that's what a deception is. You think you're doing good, but it's evil. This is evil, but it's really good. I mean, Satan said, you know, this is bad, but it's really good. So, we just have to stay alert, you know. We have some. We want to encourage Bible reading, so we have some Bible reading plans on that Kim has. You can have one. This is different. This is a chronological one that has some graphics on it. It's kind of neat. If you want, and I have more. But Kim has the one that's the chart. You can basically, it's kind of neat. You can kind of check off as you go through the year or however long you want to take, but it lets you see finally if you can get through the whole Bible.
Well, and I was telling my mom the other day, for anybody who's on Facebook, RC Sproul has a legacy group. So the legacy group said, you know, the average movie takes around 2 hours. In 2 hours, you can read Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, and Jude.
I can't study it in 2 hours.
You can't study. No, this is just reading. This is just reading.
Amy?
Yeah, my comment, I guess, when I was thinking about the commonality of those three temptations is kind of, you know, James kind of hit upon it there at the end, but the picture that's starting to come to me is that it's all about being tempted to be focusing on the created versus the creator. And, you know, all of the things and comforts and beautiful things in this world that God made, they're all wonderful, but they are things that are temporal, created things. And when we focus on those things, we lose sight of the higher beauty, which is the Creator Himself. And that's kind of.
Yeah, and every step along the way in our lives, we're not really serious. You know, we're just kind of going along trying to make things work. And if we could just try to, like, you know, they have the Jews had the thing they put over their eyes so they wouldn't forget the word of God, right? If we could just have this thing in front of us where, my thing is stay on the path, you know, stay on the path, you know, remember.
But we forget what the path is.
Yeah,
you know.
and that's why we need to study the Bible, but I just think we don't take it all seriously enough. I know I don't. And then something happens and I go, oh.
And it's that difference between living in the temporal and having to constantly be aware that we're here in this temporal, but this is not the total, this is not reality. The eternal is reality, the spiritual behind it.
This is our path toward it. This, you know, those of us that went to see the Overcomer movie, and it was, what was the girl's name?
Hannah.
Run, Hannah, run, right?
It's your
All the
granddaughter,
others,
isn't it?
Run, Hannah, run. What?
Isn't it your granddaughter?
Yeah, Elizabeth's daughter. And on this story, it's stay on the path, Christian, stay on the path. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Next week, I want you to be ready with your old trumpets.
Practice.
Oh, bring a trumpet. Bring a trumpet, yeah. Da-ba-da.
And thank you, Steve.
Hey, Christian, hold on. All right, y'all.
So if you guys want to-
Dismiss.